Chapter 5. The Consolidation of American Power. On the night of November the 22nd, 1910, a group of newspaper reporters stood disconsolately in the railway station at Hoboken, New Jersey. They had just watched a delegation of the nation's leading financiers leave the station on a secret mission. It would be years before they discovered what that mission was, and even then they would not understand that the history of the United States underwent a drastic change after that night in Hoboken. The opening lines of the late Eustace Mullins' profoundly disturbing book entitled Mullins on the Federal Reserve, meticulously researched. It's an account of what can best be described, the beginning of the end of the American dream. Later to be published under the title Secrets of the Federal Reserve, it was commissioned by the poet Ezra Pound, who had in 1948 served the second of what was to be a 13-and-a-half-year sentence as a prisoner in St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Washington, D.C. Never charged, he was declared insane by government psychologists to prevent him testifying in open court to the existence of a financial elite who conspired to push the U.S. into World War II for the purpose of profit. A plot he'd relayed to America in a series of radio broadcasts from Mussolini's Italy during the war. Perhaps the first to investigate the expanding network, Pound's intimate knowledge had been gained through years of research following the horrors of World War I, a conflict that had driven Pound to turn his brilliant intellect to better comprehend the reasons underlying a brutal and tragic conflict that stole a generation. Dangerous knowledge the NPB may have initially believed they'd stifled with the poet's incarceration in a mental institution, but had reckoned without Pound's steely resolve to commission Mullins' book, in whose preface he wrote, "Here are the simple facts of the great betrayal. Wilson, President Woodrow Wilson, and House, Colonel House, knew that they were doing something momentous. One cannot fathom men's motives, and this pair probably believed in what they were up to. What they did not believe in was representative government. They believed in government by an uncontrolled oligarchy whose acts would only become apparent after an interval so long that the electorate would be forever incapable of doing anything efficient to remedy depredations." Prophetic words that over 60 years later paint an uncannily accurate picture of a Western world run by an uncontrolled oligarchy whose lackey, well-rewarded governments have no intention of remedying depredations. Weak, manipulated politicians like the puppet Woodrow Wilson, who wrote in his book entitled The New Freedom, "Since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the U.S., in the field of commerce and manufacturing, are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." Published in the same year Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act, it may well have been the three-wise monkey policy of a fearful president and the rest of the biggest men in the U.S., but it certainly wasn't the defiant Pound's, nor indeed his protégé Mullins, who as a disciple of the essayist, gave up his plans to be a novelist, instead dedicating the rest of his life to investigating and exposing the network, a dark, dangerous and lonely road that began with his revelations of the secret conspiracy surrounding the creation of the Federal Reserve. A book that's accuracy is best reflected in the fact all copies published in Germany were subsequently seized and burnt by the then Allied-controlled authorities. Though conversely, the NBB network failed to achieve equal censure in the U.S., and in 1952, Secrets of the Federal Reserve was published by Casper and Horton, New York, becoming the first nationally circulated revelations of the top-secret meetings held by the international bankers on Jekyll Island, Georgia, between 1907 and 1910. Clandestine meetings where the draft of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was created and its introduction carefully plotted. A chilling tale of deceit detailing an oligarchy of financiers' cunning theft of a nation's wealth and its citizens' constitutional rights. Unsurprisingly, a story never subsequently divulged by the NBB-owned mainstream media, though it has been further expounded in a number of other historically accurate books, the best of which, by author and historian G. E. Griffin, who in his aptly entitled, The Creature from Jekyll Island, wrote, "The secret meeting on Jekyll Island in Georgia at which the Federal Reserve was conceived. The birth of a banking cartel to protect its members from competition, the strategy of how to convince Congress and the public that this cartel was an agency of the United States government, were 7 men who represented an estimated 1/4 of the total wealth of the entire world. Men who included Nelson W. Aldrich, Republican whip in the Senate, chairman of the National Monetary Commission, business associate of J.P. Morgan and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Abraham Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury. Frank Evander Lip, President of the National City Bank of New York, the most powerful of the banks at that time, representing William Rockefeller and the international investment banking house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Henry P. Davison, senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles D. Norton, president of J.P. Morgan's First National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And Paul M. Warburg, a partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company, a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France, and brother to Max Warburg, head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Representatives clearly demonstrating the U.S. was about to become unconstitutionally controlled by a group of international financiers, many of whom were directly linked to European banks ultimately under the control of the Anglophile Rothschild dynasty. Such need for total secrecy was due primarily to a series of previous failed attempts by the financial oligarchs to secure control of the U.S. money supply via the creation of a central bank, the last of which had been dissolved some 70 years previously, when President Andrew Jackson had wrestled back constitutional control of the money supply from what he termed a nest of vipers. Dogged resistance in sharp contrast to that the bankers had encountered in Europe. Opposition due to the fact America's founding fathers had primarily waged their war of independence to retain their non-interest-bearing money. Called American script, the currency had miraculously freed the people from the debt attached to English pounds issued by the private financiers in the Bank of England. And having been released from the bondage of the network's fiscal chains, the economy naturally enjoyed a spontaneous economic boom, wealth and prosperity the colonialists quite reasonably had no intention of giving up. Something the polymath and first founding father Benjamin Franklin pointed out when he commented, "The colonies would gladly have borne a little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money." Thus, having paid the price for their freedom from the international bankers in American colonialist blood, it would understandably take time for subsequent generations of politicians to forget their revolutionary roots, especially as the country enjoyed the early tenure of presidents like Thomas Jefferson, who famously remarked, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people, to whom it properly belongs." Sentiments later echoed by Jefferson's successor James Madison, the 4th U.S. President, who stated, "History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling the money and its issuance." And finally in 1830, when the 7th U.S. President Andrew Jackson warned the American people during his titanic battle with the Second Central Bank of the United States, Unless you become more watchful in your states and check the spirit of monopoly and thirst for exclusive privileges, you will in the end find that the control over your dearest interests has passed into the hands of these corporations. Wise words indeed from the last president, until the assassinated Kennedy, to attempt wresting back control of the money supply. A battle, fortunately for the American people, that saw Jackson survive the first assassination attempt on a U.S. president, regain control of the money supply, and in January 1835, become the only president in U.S. history to pay off the entire national debt. Though unfortunately for the American people, a majority of politicians in 1913 chose to ignore the historical evidence of a succession of American private central banks ending in ignominy and outright corruption, historical myopia due not only to fiscal ignorance, but the insidious emergence of professional politicians from the ranks of the new blue bloods' secret establishment families. Men like Senator Nelson Aldrich, whose daughter, having married into the Rockefeller oil and banking dynasty, possessed a keen vested interest in helping to push through the Federal Reserve Act, a politician who, like the rest of the NPB, possessed attitudes Pound had correctly surmised, less concerned with the representation of the people, as the control of the people. Representatives who now held sway over a diminishing number of politicians still retaining strong democratic ties to their electorate. Patriots no doubt possessing the selfless duty and moral courage of a Jefferson or Andrew Jackson, but found themselves a minority of vocal and defiant dissenters to the act. Men like Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., who warned prior to the act being passed, "This Federal Reserve Act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the President signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking bill." A dire warning that sadly went unheeded, because on a freezing Washington evening in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed by a vote of 282 to 60 in the House of Representatives and hastily confirmed by a majority of 43 to 23 in the U.S. Senate. Legislation, as the NPB had anticipated, rushed through by a distracted political elite making preparations to leave Washington for Christmas. Lindbergh Sr. said shortly afterwards, "The financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve Board. That board administers a finance system by authority of a purely profiteering group. That system is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money." A sentiment strangely echoed by a regretful puppet President Wilson a few years later, when he wrote, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world, no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction in the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." No doubt heartfelt, if rather pathetic platitudes for his part in the worst legislative crime of the ages. Cowering subservience equally evident in all subsequent presidents, until Kennedy, failing to stifle the omnipotent opinion and duress of a Federal Reserve now spanning the Atlantic, linking with the Bank of England to financially unite the old Anglo and emerging American empires, shadowy elite who from 1913 to this day subvert the autonomy of Western politicians while insidiously stealing the constitutional rights of its citizens. A network run by a tiny group of multi-billionaires who during this period surreptitiously worked to transfer wealth from the many to the few via scientifically created depressions, recessions and unconstitutional direct taxation. strategies that a century later seized the Anglo-American network, moving inexorably closer to what will ultimately become a totalitarian UN police state. A dictatorial model they first experimented with via a bloody revolution that killed millions, just 4 short years after seizing control of the US money supply.